Blessed be the fruit, and welcome back to a podcast where I talk about life in my 30s, pop culture, being a cat mom, whatever the fuck I want to talk about. Welcome back to Chaos and Fuckery. And I said blessed be the fruit at the beginning because today the thing I want to talk about, because a lot of people talked about the original show, but not a lot of people are talking about the new one, is The Testaments. Now, we are about halfway through because from my understanding, there's 10 episodes, and the day that this drops, there would have been an episode last night that I have not watched. That is episode 7. I have not watched that yet, so I will go do that after I record this episode and get this up and going. But as an OG, not an OG, I got into Handmaid's Tale in probably season 2 or 3, definitely before it got to the final season. And I had read the books before the final season of Handmaid's Tale, and I've obviously read the Testaments before the Testaments on Hulu dropped. Now, I understand with the Testaments, the series, that they've changed the timeline from the books, and obviously the books were kind of just from a historical perspective. Gilead had already fallen at the timeline in the book, but you're reading through Agnes's perspective and Aunt Lydia's. It's a multi-perspective book, and it seems the narration in the series is also a multi-perspective narration because you get Daisy, you get Aunt Lydia, you get Agnes, and so there's definitely a little bit of liberties being taken with the show. However, I think they're trying to throw people off. They have openly stated that the timeline doesn't match, therefore Daisy cannot be who she is in the book. Now, I'm going to try not to spoil things, but, we're talking about the show, so obviously, I'm going to probably end up spoiling a little bit. So, Daisy in the book is baby Nicole. I'm giving up on not spoiling. If you don't want to listen to this, don't click this episode. It's that simple. Daisy in the book is baby Nicole, and the writers have openly said that Daisy in the Testaments is not baby Nicole. We've heard a lot of theories that it's, the redhead Janine's daughter. That doesn't make sense timeline-wise either. Looking at the two actresses, while we don't have definitive ages for either of them, we know Agnes is Hannah, obviously from The Handmaid's Tale, but the ages are very close for Daisy and Agnes from what we can tell in the series. So, in theory, yes, Agnes 4 years later, which also doesn't make a ton of sense to me because Agnes at the end of Handmaid's Tale, maybe she was younger, but the book storyline is 15 years later, which also doesn't make sense. How would baby Nicole and Agnes be in the same vicinity 15 years later? Because if Agnes was, say 12 at the end of Handmaid's Tale, which isn't a timeline that's covered in the original Handmaid's Tale book, that doesn't make sense either. Because that would make Daisy Nicole, 15, give or take. She was maybe 2, so 15, 16, probably somewhere in there. And Agnes just becoming a woman, if you will, in her 30s? Which makes no fucking sense. So that timeline doesn't really make sense either, if you really think about it. But I think in Handmaid's Tale, the book, because the whole Agnes getting older, being 12, the fall of Boston, that part is unique to the show. So Agnes, when Nicole was born, I think was still a pink. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been a minute since I've read the books, and then I watched, the end of Handmaid's Tale, which is not in the Handmaid's Tale book at all. I believe Agnes, so if I remember correctly, Handmaid's Tale, the book ends when June has Nicole. The storyline of her getting Nicole out of Gilead either didn't exist or was lifted from the Testaments for the series purpose. I know for a fact, June in Canada and things like that don't exist in the book. You get glimpses of that in the Testaments, and there's a lot of Judd in the books is more like Lawrence, to the point that because I was watching the series at the same time I was reading the books, when I was reading the Testaments, Judd in my head was Lawrence. I totally confused the two of them. So the storyline that Agnes eventually is paired with Judd also isn't making sense right now. From my memory, Garth didn't exist. Like, obviously Agnes had a guardian, but it wasn't some big thing in the books, there's a lot of liberties being taken with the show, but that doesn't mean I hate it. I also just think the writers are lying and they are still going to somehow fuck with the timeline to make Daisy baby Nicole. But also, baby Nicole didn't age at the same rate that Agnes did in Handmaid's Tale. The aging of baby Nicole doesn't make sense because when June was pregnant with Nicole, Agnes was still a pink. So even with it being 4 years later, the age gap between them still would make sense. But for whatever reason, Nicole just stayed an infant for forever in the series. Because I think in order, so one thing that they've made clear is Daisy was born in Gilead and brought out of Gilead. If she's the same age as Agnes, that doesn't make sense either, because Agnes was 5 or 6 when Gilead came to be. So I'm not understanding the timeline of the series at all. And the timeline of the books is a little broken too, to be honest, from what I remember, when it comes to the sisters, right? Specifically when it comes to Agnes and baby Nicole, that timeline is very broken in both perspectives, the book and the series. I still think it is a possibility that they are setting up Daisy to be baby Nicole still. I understand the writers have said that they're not. I still could see them announcing there's some sort of timeline. Some weird thing with like Agnes not knowing time. They did make a point that, women aren't allowed to read calendars and things like that. A lot of Agnes's and Daisy's character and Becca's character, even in the books, is very much so based around the fact that they did not want to be wives. So the fact that Agnes is very, pro being a plum and a very pro like green, and I'm interested to see how they twist the story where they've gone thus far, because Becca and Agnes in the books become aunts, and that's how they meet Daisy as a Pearl Girl, and how they discover, because aunts are allowed to read, and Agnes discovers the journal that we know that Lydia is writing already. Like in the series, they have mentioned Lydia's documentation of what's going on post everything that happened with June and the Handmaids. So I don't know how they reconcile Agnes and Becca's aunt story now that she's already met the Pearl Girl Daisy. And a lot of the Testaments is based on the fact that Hannah, Agnes, and Daisy do in fact find out that they're sisters, and their connection to June. And June doesn't exist in the capacity that she already does in the show, which obviously you want to tie back to the original, blah, blah, blah. I understand the liberty taken there. There's so much going on. This show is captivating me more than Handmaid's Tale was and did, and I didn't think that was possible. I didn't think an entirely new cast. Now, this is how you do a spinoff. This is how you do a revival of something that was beloved. You don't just recreate it. And obviously it is literally a sequel book, but the book itself is very different than the original book, so it doesn't even feel like a sequel. And the same is with the series. There are little things that you're reminded, oh yeah, this is connected to Handmaid's Tale, but it is its own story. It does stand on its own. When you're a knower who's read the book, you find yourself questioning your sanity and your memory of reading the book every time you're watching the series. But I kind of love this more, because it does speak on the generation that was raised in Gilead. Sorry, this is going to annoy me. It speaks very heavily on the generation that was raised and doesn't remember the before times and how they interact with life. I do not think we will see the book Shunammite storyline. I don't think we'll see the aunt storyline. We could still see it. I just don't foresee it. I think they are making Becca out to be something she wasn't explicitly stated to be in the books. At least I don't remember that being the explicit reason why she wanted to become an aunt. I remember her being embarrassed, and they haven't really explored her dad of it all storyline at all yet. They alluded to it a little bit with Agnes's tooth cleaning, But I think Holga is going to end up being the catalyst to explore that part of the Testaments. And maybe, I'm speaking all of this having not watched last night's episode, but maybe that is in this episode, right? I've been trying to avoid spoilers and stay off the internet all day. Yeah. Because I have found my way onto the Testaments TikTok without previously having discussed it. I do think Garth is somehow connected to Nick or one of the other original Guardians, or maybe somehow Lawrence. I don't know how he would be connected to Lawrence. That would be weird. Somehow he's connected to the original cast because they're making too big of a deal out of him and his connection to Mayday for him to not have some sort of storyline connection to Janine or some storyline connection to one of the other handmaids. We don't. Obviously, that's speculation. I don't know that to be true, but they're making too big of a deal out of him for him to just be a nothing guardian, right? Obviously, there's the crush of it all and how that would be illegal in Gilead and whatever, but there's more to it than that. He might be the catalyst for Agnes's rise to Mayday fame, if you will, just like her mother. That might be the case. I don't know. He might be, someone so deep in the weeds like Nick was, because the Nick storyline didn't exist in the books. The end of Handmaid's Tale, Nick's storyline didn't exist in the books. So Nick was so deeply undercover as he was towards the end of Handmaid's Tale that you couldn't tell the difference. And I believe that might be a Garth kind of line. And maybe Garth is connected to Nick somehow. Maybe what happened to... And this wasn't really explored in the Testaments either. I don't know that this was even mentioned in the Testaments, but what happened to New Bethlehem and Lawrence's whole thing? What happened to What's-Her-Face? Serena Joy. Does she have something to say in all of this because of the liberties they've taken? Is she still in New Bethlehem? How did Handmaid's Tale end? Anyways... I think she was. I think she was still in New Bethlehem after she married that crazy-ass man. The Testaments, thus far, we're only 6-7 episodes in. We're only 6 or 7 episodes in, depending on if you've watched last night's episode. It does feel brighter and simultaneously darker than Handmaid's Tale. Handmaid's Tale felt very dark all of the time. Whereas Testaments has its moments of just girlish, rom-com-y style because these girls don't understand what they're living in. That's all they've ever known. They don't know anything different. And it's not until they start talking to the pro girls. And I am curious why the one aunt story is that she was the original pro girl. I remember there being an aunt that was Mayday that wasn't Lydia. There were a few that were in the weeds in one of the books. I don't remember which one, to be honest. But that's an interesting setup that they've already created in the series. I definitely remember Vidala being the hard ass that nobody liked in the Testaments. But there were also a few help Agnes and Daisy learn their way around types. And that is an interesting thing to explore in future episodes, I think. I do think that the Testaments, the series, is going to get a lot darker and bring a lot more of the themes from Handmaid's Tale and the problems with Gilead, especially in today's day and age, versus how it was. The books had its dark moments, but it wasn't as dark as Handmaid's Tale from what I remember reading it. It was a lot lighter of a read. I didn't feel like I had to stop and walk away from it for a little bit to not feel overwhelmed by how deeply rooted that content was. Especially knowing that Margaret Atwood wrote both books from the perspective of things that have happened in the real world. Nothing she wrote hasn't happened already somewhere in the world. And watching as I heard someone call it earlier today in a video I watched, the Mormification of the US, because apparently one of the main Hydra heads of Turning Point USA is also a returned missionary Mormon, which I will get into in a future episode when I talk about the current pop culture fascination with Mormonism as someone who's grown up around it and didn't understand why it was any different from regular Christian religions and things like that. Watching the culture turn very to garment checky and, wear more clothing in the gym women and very traditional roles and things like that. It's not just unique to Mormonism, obviously, but it is very, there are some unique things, and the creator, I will have to pull her up when I talk about that episode, definitely talked about that a lot. It's interesting to me, right? One extreme religion, whether it's Mormonism, whether it's evangelicals, whether it's, Jehovah's Witness, whoever you want to talk about, one extremist religion can lead to the creation of Gilead here in the US if they wanted to. I don't know that US culture today has enough drive behind it to do something like that, like overthrow the government, because if we did, if we wanted to organize to overthrow the government as easily as we organized to try to buy an airline, we could go either way. We could have Gilead, or we could have a wild party. Or we could have a mixture of a free-for-all and Gilead all at the same time and create the purge. I don't know. But I think watching The Testaments and Handmaid's Tale in today's day and age, seeing the themes connecting back to real life can be a hard watch. I'm not saying it's not. It is something that a lot of the actresses in The Testament specifically are getting a lot of heat for trying to connect it back. Because yes, obviously the original books were written way before what's going on today, but there are themes that they're acting and dealing with and have to live through. And I've heard a lot of actors talk about, trauma from portraying dark characters and dark themes. Evan Peterson is one that comes to mind. Like after he did Dahmer and after he did all of American Horror Story, all of that back to back to back, he needed to detox from the evil characters, essentially, because it was starting to affect him personally and mentally. And I could totally see that, because you get so deep into your character, you start to become one with that character. And some of these characters are terrifying, specifically in Evan Peters' case, right? So I could definitely see these girls who, some of them, I've never seen them in anything else, portraying these dark characters and this very dark world that is full of very real themes connecting to very real life right now in the US, and wondering, are we on the pipeline to Gilead? Because in the words of June, Gilead wasn't Gilead at the beginning. It was all in the name of safety. It was all in the name of just, for a couple weeks. And we're now at that point where people are talking about extra terms and martial law and militarized streets. And you find yourself wondering, if in the wrong hands, do I end up in Gilead? If we sit back and watch it happen, do I end up in Gilead? And I'm not saying it is a reality. I'm saying I can understand how people are connecting this content to real life right now and worrying about their future, specifically with women, worrying about, will I show up to a store one day, tap my card, and suddenly it wouldn't exist? And suddenly my bank account's no longer mine. It's locked until I hand it over to my nearest male relative. I am thankful, I have a husband that I could trust in a situation like that, but not everyone does. Not everyone has a male relative that they can trust in that situation. And that is a wild thought to me, that even some of these conversations are even being joked about. Right? There are active groups saying that women shouldn't be allowed to vote, that women, it has to be a collective household vote. There is a lot that can connect the early days leading up to Gilead, fertility crisis, to what's going on right now. There was a Fox News host that recently said that the issue was 15 to 19-year-olds not having enough babies. When I was a teen, the whole, they would talk about the reason that they put Teen Mom on MTV was to show the horrors of being a teen mom and how it's a struggle and it's not easy. Granted, that show lost the plot eventually, but that was its original thought process of showing 16 pregnant and teen mom was, hey, this is not what you want. Protect yourself, that kind of thing. We wanted to prevent teen pregnancies, not glorify them, not make them a necessity to declining birth rates. I don't even know why we're tracking that data as a part of the declining birth rate data. That should be declining. It just should be. And so, yeah, I definitely can see the people that connect media, like The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, and I do think the Testaments is a good watch. We're only halfway through the first season, and I don't know if they've been signed to a second season or not, but it is more intriguing to me because it helps me specifically understand some of my Mormon relatives, some of my more evangelical friends and relatives that truly do believe in a world like Gilead. They would love to live in a world like Gilead, I guess is my point, where none of these other things exist. And, well, I don't really want to understand them. It does help showcase why I don't want to understand them, why I have no contact with a lot of people. They don't want me to exist in a world that I exist in, and they would choose Gilead, and that's why I made the decisions I did. So I think it is an interesting think piece to watch this show and watch these girls who grew up in Gilead experience life. Because it is different than the handmaids who knew another life, or even Paula. Paula is such a more complex character in the show than she was in the book. In the book, she was kind of just the wicked stepmom, if you will. And they're making her a much, or maybe the actresses are just playing her a lot more complex of, I had a life before this and now I'm forced to be this other thing, and it's for my own survival rather than just a hater and wanting a child of her own and not accepting Agnes. She seems to be more of a hard ass, but also wanting to connect with Agnes in a way that she wasn't in the books. There's also an interesting plot point in the books that has been removed, and that is Agnes's interaction with a handmaid for the first time. And we're way past that age timeline. In the series started past that age timeline, right? But I think that plot point is kind of pivotal to Agnes waking up. And I'm interested to see how the series course corrects for that, alongside the fact that Agnes and Daisy are not supposed to meet until Agnes and Becca, our aunts, have been matched and didn't like their matches, were afraid of their matches. Agnes realized she'd been assaulted. That whole thing comes to be in the books at the point at which we are in the series right now, but none of that has happened. So they're making the current episodes to date have been a lot more frivolous, and these girls living blindly in Gilead with tea parties and balls and guardian crushes, whereas Daisy is, the man undercover and all of that. Which Daisy was always the man undercover. That is her character from the beginning. But the fact that they're not showing Agnes's plot that is very pivotal in the book makes me interested to how they're going to rectify, Becca's match, or Agnes's match currently is not matchable. So I don't really know how that works either. It is a lot to think on as we go through the series as someone who's read the books of how are they going to rectify this? How are they going to rewrite the story a little bit? And obviously they're taking liberties, but there's still original source material, right? How do they make this work in a world where they've kind of completely destroyed the plot? And yet they still made a good series. And I am usually a hater when writers take extreme liberty from the original source material. Perfect example to that for me was the Maze Runner series. I watched the Maze Runner movies and they're like, okay, they weren't, I have to watch it. I don't think I've watched them again since. But then I read the Maze Runner books and I was like, holy hell, this was not the same thing. They are not even remotely the same. Like, there's a brief outline in maybe the first Maze Runner movie, but there was so much extra to it that nobody ever saw. And it was wild to read that particular series in the context of having watched the movies and saw just how different they were. They just didn't align at all. And I'm feeling something similar with the Testaments, but the series itself doesn't need to follow. Gilead is so intriguing and the characters are so intriguing that you don't need the exact plot point. You just need to create a similar catalyst for Agnes's eventual wake-up call. And that's where I'm curious how we're gonna get there. But I'm gonna go watch the new episode because I love Love this series. I love dystopian futures, especially right now where they don't feel so dystopian. Hunger Games, Handmaid's Tale, Divergent, all of those things. They are Ready Player One, I think, is by far my favorite in today's tech age. And, you know, AI and ads everywhere and capitalism. Ready Player One, I think, is a good read. And Ready Player Two are a good read for everybody in today's day and age. I see the world currently behind the lens of Ready Player One and Handmaid's Tale, which is a very weird combination, I will admit. It is a very weird combination to see both, you know, the tech oligarch, ads everywhere, capitalism hellscape, where everyone escapes into virtual reality to just survive life in a never-ending environmental nightmare, and then Handmaid's Tale, who created a perfect bubble of a world because the environment was going to shit and a fertility crisis hit so hard that they couldn't go forth and be fruitful anymore for their religion. Those are two weird things to have going on simultaneously, but if you really look at the world right now, those things are coexisting, and my brain breaks because I never would have put those two in the same category. I never would have put religious extremism and an emphasis on fertility and an emphasis on, you know, raising the children and being prudish and the horrors of Gilead in the same time frame as technology zaniness. And, you know, obviously Ready Player One is a commentary on capitalistic hellscapes. But again, one doesn't typically, because, you know, typically extreme religion is very homemaker and not very capitalistic focus. So to have both coexisting at the same time is a very interesting mind fuck in my brain of puzzles. But I also realize that reality is not a book or TV series. However, I read so often and escape and play video games and things like that I do start to see my reality through the lenses of books I've read, dystopian futures specifically, because I do read a lot of those and start predicting things that are going to happen in the world. And yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I see the world purely in the lens of Ready Player One and Handmaid's Tale, which is just a wild twist. But that is all for this week. I'm going to go watch the new episode, and I'm sure I will have commentary at the beginning of next week's episode just because I could talk about this stuff for days. I would love to get other people on that could go back and forth, you know, when the Testaments is over or whatever, and just go back and forth on details and how it relates to today and all of those things. I would love to just chat with people. So if you have comments on the Testaments, what are your thoughts? Is Becca a gender traitor? Are we going to see the storyline where Becca and Agnes become aunts like they do in the book? Do you think Paula is a better character in the series than she is in the book? All of those things that we talked about in this episode, talk about them in the comments because I'd love to have conversations with you. So other than that, that is my chaos and fuckery for this week, and I'm going to go watch the new episode.